from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I want to welcome all of you back to our series that we're doing entitled Journey Through Time, Conversations with the World's Great Women and Men. On this particular week, I have three of my friends, and we're going to visit with Sacajawea. She lived from 1788 to 1884, or she was 96 at the time of her death. She was, as many of you know, a member of the Shoshone Indian tribe. She also was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Northwest from 1803 to 1805. During that expedition, she served as both an interpreter and a guide. She's been remembered in many, many ways in history, and as we put this series together, we thought it was very appropriate to visit with her. The person who's with us today to portray Sacajawea is Jeannie Eder, and we're very delighted to have you here, Ms. Eder. She is currently working on a PhD degree at Washington State University. She holds an MA degree in history from Montana State University. She also is a former assistant professor of history at Western Montana College. Our guest has received the Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of North Dakota in 1980. She is an author, and she is an enrolled member of the Sioux tribe. And this role in the historical series that we're doing, Sacajawea, welcome. We're very delighted to be with you. Thank you for taking time. And I have with me today, first of all, is Janelle Burke, and then Steve Shink and Jeannie Givens to visit with you and to discuss your life. At this time, I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us and to be able to talk to you, Sacajawea, about your life. What was it like when you were born? Where were you born? And what kind of a life did a young American Indian person live at that time?
I was born in a place near Lemhi, Idaho. And my family traveled that whole area of what they now called the Beaverhead River area. We also traveled over to the Three Forks area, Three Forks of the headwaters of the Missouri. And it was there that I was having a normal day and a normal life at the age of 8. Children were allowed to be free and independent. Very seldom were we disciplined physically, and we were allowed to pretty much roam as we wanted to, oftentimes helping the older women gather berries and such. And we were doing that, looking for some roots at the time when the Hidadsas or the Minataris came and charged among us, and we scattered and all ran to hide at that time. And several of us were kidnapped as children at that point. And along with them was a very good friend of mine. And we were taken then by horseback to the Hidadsa villages along the Missouri River in a place called North Dakota.
Were your captors kind to you, the people who took you kind to
Oh,
you?
yes. Yes, they were very nice to us. And there were many captives in the village. That happened quite a bit for people who had lost some children, or the children had died and they kidnapped others and were presented, those children were presented to people to raise as their own.
So it was much like an adoption proceeding then, sort of one family had lost a child and they might want to replace it, so they would find a child that they could bring into their family and love and care for. That was the kind of procedure that it was. It was not hard feelings or ill will between the tribes. Nor were you a slave.
No, I wasn't a slave, but it certainly was hard for me. I think it changed my attitude about how I thought about life in general. I just, after that, just took each day as it came and really didn't see any particular place as home.
Did you have to learn a new language too?
I learned the Hidatsa language, yes, and then French, because we had a lot of French traders at that time, and I married Toussaint Charbonneau, who was French, and so I spoke French, Hidatsa and Shoshone. And it was my ability to speak Shoshone that I think encouraged Lewis and Clark to take me along with them on the expedition in hopes that they would run into my people.
And what kind of a man was your husband? You married him, how old would you have been approximately when you married him?
I was about 16 when I married him.
Was that a normal age for a young
Yes.
woman to marry?
Among the Shoshone people, children are promised very early in life. Maybe two mothers would have children of the same age, one boy and one girl, and then the two mothers might promise that when the boy and girl grew up that they would marry. I was promised in the Shoshone tribe at a very young age. But among the Hidatsas, marriage at 16 was fairly normal.
And
Steve Sheen.
Sacajawea, in your early life with your own tribe, the Sioux tribe, was there contact at that time between white people and your tribe?
Oh, sure. We had seen white people for years before Lewis and Clark's expedition, and it's in our oral traditions and in some of our ceremonies. There are some similarities, and I think that some of that is the influence of those white people that we had seen previously.
The Hidatsa in North Dakota, did they also have regular contact with white people?
Oh, yes.
But
yes.
that much further west, would that contact largely be trappers and things like that, as opposed to settlements?
Well, some people they called themselves Vikings, and they came among us, fathered many children, and we carry those bloodlines of red-haired children. We still carry those today. So they were very much a part of our culture, hundreds of years before Lewis and Clark.
Is it common for tribes like the Hidatsa who make their homes in North Dakota to travel as far as the Ohio Valley for raiding parties? Is that unusual?
Not for the young men. We sent young men a long way from home because sometimes they just needed to get that energy out and go other places. And so going that far wasn't unusual at all.
Jeannie Gibbons.
Sacajawea, tell us about, once the journey began, tell us about some of the peculiarities you observed. Were you the only woman on the expedition?
Not all the time. They did run into other Indian tribes, other Indian peoples, and there were always other Indian women around. So I didn't feel like I was oftentimes the only one. So there were a lot of things that happened. Sometimes I would just sit back and be amazed at what had happened. And sometimes I just calmly handled things because there was no use getting excited about things that didn't do any good.
I asked about peculiarities. You were traveling with a lot of men, and what was that like? What were some of your observations? What peculiar things did they do?
Oh, let's see, peculiar things. Well, they didn't bathe very often. That was something I found unusual. But other things is they kept writing a lot in these books, spending a lot of time. And not only did they write in books, but they wrote on everything in Mother Nature, And they'd see a high rock that maybe stood out, and they'd all want to stop and climb up there and write their names into that rock. I thought that was very unusual. Wherever we went, they were always writing their names in things. Those rocks and those trees had their own names. I wonder what the rocks and trees thought about those Bashjile writing their names on them. So those were just a couple examples.
And what about their eating habits? Were they like yours, or are they different?
Well, They'd eat anything I found for them, actually, because they weren't very good at finding food for themselves. And if they weren't good at hunting meat, which is one of the things that they ate a lot of, then I had to show them berries that they could eat or roots that they could have and dig up and eat. So when we got near starving sometimes, they'd eat almost anything I'd find for them.
Sacajawea, we introduced the program and said that we were coming to talk with you about the expedition, and you've been getting some questions along that with Lewis and Clark. There's a lot of confusion in history exactly what your role was, and we want you to take this opportunity to talk about. I introduced the fact that you were both an interpreter and a guide. I guess I will ask it this way. Were they very good at geography and where they were going, or did they get lost a lot? And how many times did they need an interpreter as they moved across the trail?
Many times they needed an interpreter, but for a while in the beginning, they were going up the Missouri River, so there wasn't really a need for a whole lot of guidance. But when they came to the headwaters of the Missouri River, that's where I recognized that area, that place where I was kidnapped. And from there, they didn't know where to go. They argued a lot about where to go. And so I just pointed out to them Beaverhead Rock and said, that's where my people are. This is our summer area, and so you're going to find my people in that direction. But as far as interpretation, it was always good to meet other Indian people. They were always there, although they said sometimes they didn't see a whole lot of Indians. There was always sign that the Indians certainly saw us.
And you spoke 4 languages, so this way you could help fill it. Did they have anyone else as an interpreter, or were you able to?
Oh yes, my husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, was an interpreter, and oftentimes when he couldn't use the verbal language, he used sign language. And that was pretty standard throughout many Indian nations, sign language.
Janelle Berg.
I have always wondered, how do people keep track of where they are? What kind of compass did you use, if any? And how did you guide them across? What were the landmarks? How were landmarks identified as people moved about in those days? Whether or not it was on the expedition, although I'm sure you used your skills that you had on the expedition. But how did people just normally, how did the Indians find their way from one place to another? From their winter spot to the summer grounds?
Well, I didn't have a compass. I didn't know how to use such a thing, but I know that Lewis and Clark needed that to guide by. So I saved their compass from floating down river once. But as far as Native peoples go, we always talked to the tribes in the area and would ask about important places. And then we always were aware of the surroundings. We always knew where a high mountain was. Particular rocks, like one that Lewis and Clark, Clark called it Pompey's Rock, named after my son. It's a very significant rock. It's different than all the other rocks in that area. The same way with a particular point on the west coast. So even Beaverhead Rock is a huge rock. It looks like a huge beaver swimming in the water, so you can't miss it if you just look around. And Lewis and Clark were always climbing the highest point in the area for the day to see how far they could see. And so because I was just aware of those things in nature, I was always looking at those things too.
Before we go on to Steve, I'm going to point out to our viewing audience that you are wearing a beautiful ivory skin dress, and it with beads on it, and it's very beautiful. This is the kind of thing that Sacajawea might have worn, a dress, except would she have worn that color?
No, this is more
color.
Ceremonial. She would have worn a darker tanned hide because things would get dusty and dirty on the trail, and so it would be darker hide. But yes, she always wore a dress. That was the way it was with Indian women. You always had a long dress. You always wore moccasins.
Steve Sheen.
Sacajawea, in your travels with the Lewis and Clark expedition, how many different tribes would you say that you encountered?
Oh, several different tribes, 50, 60 maybe.
And were the reactions of those tribes to the expedition generally cordial? Was the expedition welcome?
Except for the Blackfeet.
Oh.
We were very, very wary of the Blackfeet because we were traveling through their country for a long time. But the area that my people had, the Shoshone, was kind of a common hunting ground with the Blackfeet and the Crows and the Nez Perce. So that was a fairly safe area. Other tribes were friendly. Some were friendly. Some of them had seen white men before and knew that white men had gifts. Mm-hmm. So they would come out and want to, give me those gifts. Kind of like those who hang around the forts, mm-hmm. For handouts.
You mentioned that starvation was at times a problem. Were there other hardships that you and the members of the expedition had to endure?
Oh, yes. Rain a lot of times slowed us down. Mosquitoes could be terrible in some of the climates. And then I told them to just cover themselves with mud. And they used that white cloth that they built a frame for to sleep under. That was pretty nice. Fleas, when we were sometimes camped in areas that had dead critters around, there were a lot of fleas. And sometimes we'd have to get rid of those, So.
Judy Gibbons.
You married a Frenchman, a trader, I understand. What was he like as a person? Was he good to you?
Well, most of the time he was good to me. But there were a few times when we would argue a lot. He didn't like the fact that I was interpreting more and more as we went along. I think he was worried that when we got to my people that I would leave him, and I didn't. But I wasn't the only wife he had. He had other wives, and he was, he thought he was very good looking, I think. So he was always looking at other women. And once he slapped me, and Clark got very angry at him, and I just thought to myself, I was going to put something in his meal that night that would make him think twice. So.
You had a very, very great knowledge of foods and herbs and so forth, and so you had your own way of dealing with those problems.
Yes.
In history, there's been a real great discussion about you and how you may have affected the safety of the trip. Some historians that have lived after you have indicated the fact that you're on the trip that there might have been a much more safe trip for Lewis and Clark. Would you address that question?
There might have been a more safe trip?
Yes, the fact that you were on the trip, that it would show that the expedition, that
yes.
you would not have supported if it had been warlike, and that if its mission was for war purposes.
Well, they carried a lot of gifts with them, which was good. I didn't like the fact that they carried whiskey and gave Indians that. But I think that having an Indian woman with a child present oftentimes saved them from war parties.
That's what I'm speaking to.
So
yes.
that was good for them. Other than that, I think I helped out as much as I could with plants and foods and herbs. And then when I got sick, though, I had to depend a whole lot on Clark to help make me better.
You were sick on the trip itself?
Yes, a couple of times I was very sick, had stomach pain and some problems, and he gave me some of his medicine.
It indicates that you were gone from 1803 to 1805, or that's how long the expedition lasted. When you got to the end of the trip west, how long did the expedition stay before they started the trip back? And you came back with them? up to Wyoming. That's my understanding.
Oh, how long did I stay where in
I
St.
mean,
Louis?
when you got to when you
Or
left
in the West
and went
Coast?
west, when you got to the end of the journey, and you were going to return, how long was it before that you started?
We stayed the winter. We built a fort and stayed the winter there and saw many things like the whales and the big fish, and met with some of the people there. Looked at how they dressed and such. But we spent a winter there before heading back because we needed to have refresh our supplies and such.
And when you returned, you did not come all the way back to St. Louis, is that correct?
No, I didn't. My husband's job as interpreter was over when we were back in the Mandan Hidatsa villages. And so there wasn't any use for him. Clark offered to have him come with them to St. Louis, but since they really couldn't think of a reason why he should come, then he stayed. But they also offered that in some future time that we would be welcome to go to St. Louis, particularly because Clark wanted to educate our son, Baptiste.
And did he do that?
Yes.
Was Baptiste?
Yes. Things got very hard for Toussaint, and Clark heard about that, and so he offered us several options. He offered to keep myself and our son while Toussaint went to fur trading company. He also offered to have us just all come down there, and he would give us some land. He also offered to take care of us in any way possible if we wanted to stay. So we decided to go to St. Louis, and we took took Clark up on to buy the land, and then he did end up raising our son. But Toussaint wasn't a man who was going to sit still very long, and he went back to live with the Mandans, and I went to live with the Shoshones, my people. That's kind of where I wanted to go.
Steve Sheen.
Sacajawea, you're a very famous person, but I wonder if you're happy with the way that you are remembered, especially as it regards your part of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Oh, it's good for storytelling. I like to sit around with the other people and tell them about stories on the expedition, but I don't see myself as having done anything important. I was just there, as any Indian woman would have done. I just lived off the land from day to day because that's all I knew.
If you were offered the chance to make the journey again, would you take it?
Yes, because I got to see so many people and so many things I never would have seen. In fact, I was very angry that they weren't going to let me see that big fish after I walked all those miles. And when the local Indian people said that the whales, those big fish, were out in the ocean, they were going to go without me. And I was a little mad about that.
Jeannie Gibbons.
Sacajawea, pulling a little bit out of character to Jeannie Eder, would you tell us if you have any conflict as a modern Indian woman doing this role of Sacajawea?
I did at first have conflict because I see Sacajawea as a heroine of white culture. And yet, when I was invited to do her, I decided to read about her in the journals. What do they say about this woman? There's not very much written about her, but in the end, she just wants to be a normal Indian woman who lives off the land, who has compassion for people, who believes in the value of honesty and family. And I think that her strengths as an Indian woman are not apparent in the journal. And so therefore, those are some issues that Indian women today need to hear about. And they need to see those. And young Indian women need to know that Sacajawea probably did a whole lot more than the men ever admitted in their journal.
And she's not referred to very frequently throughout the journals.
No, she's not referred to. But she had to have been a strong influence on the things that they did.
Certainly.
It's just that the white men don't have the same idea of woman's role as Indian women do and as Indian men do. They know that, the woman has great power. And so we have a sacred place, and we make a sacred place for men. So among the Hidatsa people, Shoshone people, the roles are equal. But there wasn't equality on that expedition.
Do you think Native Americans will look up to you, will honor your place in history? Are you a heroine to Native Americans?
No, but I think she can be. I think that hopefully with my portrayal of Sacajawea, that they can come to look at her as a strong woman, because the words of the journal have not given her the credit that she obviously helped them a lot more. And I think that that was the history of the time. You didn't write about women being strong. So I'm hoping that my portrayal will at least speak to those issues.
Thank you.
We're just almost out of time in just about 20 seconds. Ms. Sacajawea, what was the most exciting thing on the trip for you?
Seeing my family, seeing my brother, Kamehawe, recognizing the place where I had grown up, that was the exciting thing. But I'd have to say the other thing was the big fish. I was so amazed to see that.
On that note, we'll bring the program to conclusion. You've been very kind to us and answering our questions, and you've taught us so much about what you did in your life. And on behalf of the 3 panel members and myself, we thank you very much. And it has been a very, very special 30 minutes for us. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join us again next week when we're going to continue this series called Journey Through Time, Conversations with the World's Great Women and Men. And as we do this, we are chosen people in history that we thought that if you had that opportunity that you would like to talk with them if you could. And we think this is the next best thing by bringing these individuals to you that are portraying so well these people in history. Until next week, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.